Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Colin Firth finds himself left at the mercy of the sea. In 1968, amateur sailing enthusiast Donald Crowhurst, played by Colin Firth, much to the surprise of his wife Claire, played by Rachel Weisz, signs up to join the Sunday Times Golden Globe race, a complete circumnavigation of the world without stopping. Despite having no experience at sea, Donald builds his own boat, the Teignmouth Electron, and puts everything he has on the line for his dream. But once he sets out, Crowhurst finds himself very ill-prepared for the unforgiving nature of the open ocean. The story of Donald Crowhurst was a major media sensation back in its day and has inspired numerous books, TV movies and documentaries about the subject and the Golden Globe race, including the highly acclaimed doc Deep Water. The Mercy is a fictionalised version of it, but it sticks fairly close to the facts as far as we know, and that's the important part here, because of the circumstances, we'll never know exactly for certain what happened here. We have a fairly good idea, but there's always that margin for error. And I think it's that sort of mystery about it that draws so many people towards these events. And speaking of the amount of things that the story of Crowhurst has yielded, this film was made by Studio Canal. It's a fairly big budget production for them. But weirdly, they also picked up another film about the same subject, this much smaller indie movie called Crowhurst, which is executive produced by Nicholas Rowe, who apparently wanted to make a film about this very guy for a very, very long time. And so there is apparently a contractual stipulation when they picked up Crowhurst that they had to release it a certain amount of time after they released The Mercy. So Crowhurst is getting this very tiny release about 6 to 8 weeks after The Mercy premiered at the end of March. And this is a really bizarre situation. I have never seen a distributor have to handle 2 films about the same subject in less than 2 months. Speaking of release dates, I first became aware of The Mercy when it was tentatively scheduled for October 2017, and you can clearly tell from my description of it that this was meant to be an awards bait movie, because you look at this movie on paper and it has 2 big British stars in it, and the director of the film, he was the director of the Stephen Hawking biopic The Theory of Everything, which of course won Eddie Redmayne his Oscar. And then the release date moved. It moved to New Year's Day at first, and then it went back to February. And what is happening now, I think, is that February is starting to become sort of this dumping ground for prestige pictures that didn't quite work out. And I get the impression that they sat down and watched The Mercy that, in principle, looked like it was going to be a very serious contender. And as the film eventually ran by, they realised that there was this very handsomely well-made film that simply wasn't going to win that many awards. If you came into this movie completely cold and you didn't know anything about Donald Crowhurst, and there's a very good chance that you would, because I think a lot of people have maybe forgotten about this episode, it's 50 years ago now, then you might actually mistake the very earliest scenes of The Mercy for being inspirational, because we first meet Donald Crowhurst as an inventor and an entrepreneur. He's created this handheld device that allows you to track your coordinates at sea using radio waves. And so we meet this clearly very intelligent, very astute man that has a family, but Firth portrays him like there is an emptiness within him. He feels incomplete despite all that he has accomplished for himself, and he wants to do something remarkable and cement his legacy, and he sees in this Golden Globe race this chance to do that. He sees himself as this self-made little man, essentially, that's going to prove that anyone can do it. What he sets his sights on is that the Golden Globe race, just to be clear, is a race that goes all around the world without stopping, and there are 2 prizes at the end of it. So the first prize is the first to complete it, and the second prize is the fastest to complete it. And the latter prize is what Crowhurst is aiming for. He wants to really define himself by using a ship of his own creation, of his own ingenuity, and filled with his own customizations and inventions that haven't been used before, and that is the way that he's going to make himself become famous. So he goes all in on this idea, almost as if it's a lark at first. He seems to embrace it with this giddy enthusiasm, and then reality hits. Then the movie starts to take a somewhat darker turn. The warning signs start to become very, very apparent early on when Crowhurst is building his boat, the Teignmouth Electron, and it starts to become clear that he's running out of money. And worse, the parts that he wants for the boat, he wants very specific parts imported, they aren't arriving on time, and so he has to keep pushing the date he's going to leave back, and back again. He suddenly has to make this very big gamble on what he's doing. He hires a press agent who's played by David Thewlis in the film, wonderfully unscrupulously, and he goes all in with his business partner, played by Ken Stott, and they make this arrangement where that in order to get the financing that he needs, he mortgages his house and signs away his company and all his inventions if he doesn't complete the race. Everything is about completing the race. There is no other option at this point. And that's when Crowhurst's initial vigour starts to become much more hesitant. And you can clearly tell that there is this enormous burden of pressure on the man now, because suddenly what seems so far away has become all too real and has very significant stakes. The Mercy is one of the final films scored by composer Johan Johansson, who sadly passed away recently. In fact, he died on the weekend that this was released in the UK. And you can feel that tone shift in his score. The earliest scenes of the movie have the same sort of buoyancy as Crowhurst in his initial enthusiasm, and then it starts to become a bit more melancholic. Once Crowhurst sets out into the ocean, however, it becomes very clear that he's out of his element, and he's suddenly thrust into a position where he is completely and totally alone against the void, and he is trapped inside this stormy, unpredictable weather that is battering his boat. And what's worse is that his boat clearly is severely flawed. He starts to realise that there are serious faults in his own design, in that the boat is taking on water, there are certain parts of the boat that are under spec. You have to remember that Crowhurst himself is totally inexperienced at navigating the sea, and so this is a completely frightening and alienating environment to begin with. And in these scenes, I do have to admit that the film reminded me of the Robert Redford movie All Is Lost to a certain extent, and you can certainly see influences of that in the scenes here. There's a great little scene here where Crowhurst has to climb up to the top of his mast to try and fix one of his inventions that he's made to stop himself capsizing, to see if it's in some way salvageable, and he climbs up to the top of it, and he suddenly finds himself overwhelmed. He clutches to the top of this mast, and I think it's at that moment you can really see in Firth's performance that this is a man that has realised that he is suddenly taking on something that is beyond what he can truly achieve. And that's what The Mercy is all about. It's about testing one's limits and pushing your boundaries as hard as you can, and then the boundaries bump back. You suddenly realise that maybe you don't have it in you. You don't have what it takes. Maybe you lack the experience, and maybe your best just simply isn't good enough. And what do you do next at that point? And I think we've all experienced certain moments in our lives where we suddenly find ourselves completely lost, like Crowhurst is. And that's what Crowhurst has to make a choice about. He has to decide where is he going to go from here, because his options are very slim. He either proceeds in his boat and he gives himself a 50-50 chance of survival, or he retires from the race and he goes back and loses everything. So without trying to spoil anything, I will say that Crowhurst makes a decision at this point, and that decision is some sort of attempt at salvaging his enterprise. And initially it seems like he might have found some way out of his situation, but then he has to cut himself off further because he ceases radio transmission as part of what he decides to do, and as such it becomes a movie where he is simply stuck with himself and his thoughts and his growing guilt at everything that he has decided to do, everything that he's embarked upon, and that eventually starts to completely consume him. And this is where I think the film starts to run into problems, because I don't think the filmmakers were quite sure how to get an audience emotionally invested in this story, which has large chunks where Colin Firth is simply on a boat talking to himself. And I have to admit that I went into The Mercy expecting a quite dour affair, and it isn't. It actually surprised me in that respect, but I really shouldn't have been, because Marsh helms this with exactly the kind of middlebrow sensibility that you would expect for something that was trying to aim for awards candidacy, in that it's trying to play to a fairly mainstream audience. And so the film actually has what I would deem a fairly fast pace, in that it keeps cutting very, very quickly. Cut. And you must be wondering, how is that possible? Well, the answer is, the film is absolutely full of either flashbacks or cutting away to Claire back on the mainland waiting for her husband. Every time they cut away to the other timelines, they shift the focus away from where I think the story really should be, which is the isolation that Donald is experiencing. It essentially sabotages the film because we can't quite relate to Crowhurst's situation, because the film's very structure simply does not allow us to. And it shows that the filmmakers were really desperate to try and get the audience on Crowhurst's side and to try and make him relatable, when really just showing his day-to-day experience in a fairly real, unbroken frame of time would have done that properly, I think. And the film never does anything like that. And instead we get all these flashback scenes where there's a scene where he's inside his boat and he looks at a toaster, and suddenly he flashes back to him being gifted the toaster. And I understand what the premise of that scene is. It's meant to represent that even the smallest item can suddenly have this huge emotional significance, but at the same time, it's a flashback scene of someone being gifted a toaster. It doesn't feel like it's entirely necessary to the narrative being portrayed on screen. And I think to some extent it's because the movie tries to frame itself as a love story. That's their inroad. It's a very strange thing to do, to turn this into some kind of love story, especially because so much of the movie is about them being apart from one another. And I just don't think the structure and the very story that it's trying to tell is really aided by that kind of perspective on the material. If there is a benefit to this framing though, it's Rachel Weisz, who I think is the film's real heart and centre. At first, I do have to admit that I wondered why an actor of Weisz's stature was in such a peripheral part. She plays Crowhurst's wife Claire. In the earliest stages of the film, she's very much kept in the dark by her husband, in that he doesn't consult with her before he enters the race. He springs it on her as a surprise, and I don't think he tells her about the real hardship that he's going through. I don't think he's actually told her about the fact that he's had to stake everything on what he's doing. So you have this character that in some senses is oblivious, but at the same time, she's absolutely aware of the dangers of what he's doing. She doesn't claim to understand it. You can clearly tell that she is someone who doesn't really know why he's trying to do this. He has a family. He has her. Surely that should be enough to complete him. But at the same time, tries to support his ambition as best as she can, while somewhat humouring it, because she doesn't think that he's actually going to go through with it. And then it suddenly turns out that he is actually going to, and that starts to become a real worry for her, for obvious reasons, because he's essentially putting his life on the line here. And I think that's kind of the conflict that the film wants to derive from this character, in that Claire wants to try and dissuade him from following that ambition, but at the same time she has to wrestle with the fact that if she does so, would that affect their relationship? Would Donald ever forgive her for making him give up on his one big chance? But these scenes with Claire have a real poignancy, increasingly so over time, as you come to realise their purpose. And her character's all about uncertainty, because she doesn't know where her husband is. She doesn't know what's going on with him, and all she can do is hope. Just hope for the best for him. Hope that he's doing well in his race. Hope that everything is going according to plan, and hoping that today he might call her on the phone. Hoping that today she might get some message of where he is. And that's all about her character. It's all about keeping hope in spite of all the circumstances. I do think that while the movie obviously wasn't as successful as they were hoping for, there's still enough here that I think is fascinating, especially because this is such a bizarre true life episode that's at least worthy of a look, especially if what I've said about it has made you curious or you don't know about Crowhurst's story. I do think it has some merit as a dramatic reenactment. I just think the filmmakers weren't really sure what they wanted to say about it. As such, it doesn't quite resonate in the way that it really should do. But it still works to a certain degree because it's competently staged and it has some very good performances. So it does have some heft. This isn't a total failure. I just think that, like Crowhurst himself, it's a case of misplaced ambition. The Mercy is a moving biopic of Donald Crowhurst and his ill-fated voyage that will be particularly intriguing to those who are less familiar with the story and the turns it takes. Strongly acted by both Firth as a man whose ambition exceeds his grasp and Weisz as his wife waiting for his return, the film is unfortunately hindered by the dual narrative that shifts between the two leads. The film cuts away to too many flashbacks or elsewhere to give a true sense of either partner's extreme loneliness and separation, never truly deciding on a vantage point for its story of devotion. Although clearly a prestige picture that did not set sail, The Mercy is well directed and manages a degree of poignancy in its sympathetic portrait of Crowhurst, despite being not as fulfilling as it could have been. If you like this review, then you can set a course for my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.